Hello, everybody. Welcome to Daily Kos, the Brief, our weekly show about politics. I'm Marcos, Melissa's co-host, along with Kara Celaya, who is our guest co-host today. Our typical co-host, Carrie Alaveld, is at Disneyland with her,
Oh, is she?
with her girls. So she gets some time off, and we get to carry the show today. So, Kara, thank you so much for joining me today in guest or in co-hosting. And this is going to be a very good show because my political hero is going to be our guest. This is out of everybody we'll ever talk to, the Reverend Dr. William Barber is our guest. He's everything. And we're going to talk a little bit more about all the things he's building in North Carolina. But if you are into whatever issue you're into, he's been working at it too. I promise you. I
think he's the perfect example. I'm fangirling over here because I have not had the pleasure of getting to meet him yet. So this is like a very exciting time for me. But I think he's the perfect example of how the work that we do is always inherently intersectional. And he's living embodiment of that.
Oh my God, yeah. And it's interesting and maybe even a little bit ironic for me to talk about him as my hero. And one of my lifelong heroes, just in my entire life, has been the Archbishop Romero in El Salvador and his fight for poor people before the revolution, before the 1980 Civil War, 1979, 1980 Civil War. And so it's a little bit ironic because I'm actually an atheist, and sort of my two big political heroes are both men of faith.
Yeah, I also am a non-believer, and I went to a Jesuit school for grad school by choice because in Latin America there is this huge liberal movement that definitely started with the Jesuit Catholics in Honduras. We're both Central American today hosting the show, so but yeah, and I think that really comes at the core of, in the United States, so much of our civil rights movement really does come out of the church. And how that sort of plays into, some of our conceptions or misconceptions of faith, because then there's also like the evangelical right and what they organize around. And it'll be interesting to talk about this a little bit further, but everything from, MLK to, even Malcolm X, so he was of the Muslim faith. Faith played a very big part in their activism.
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring up white evangelicals because they are in a lot of ways perverting the idea of faith. I mean, if I was to read, the typical, black church sermon is actually quite inspiring, uplifting. It's about love and fellowship and community and the struggle for something greater. And yet I had this sort of reaction, this almost visceral reaction to talk about God and church that's very negative. And it's not because of them, it's because of white evangelicals and certain segments of the Catholic Church as well, which is the church I grew up in, that have sort of abandoned those teachings of love and fellowship. And it's about exclusion, it's about hatred, it's about judging people for who they want to be. Mm-hmm. And we're even seeing evidence recently, there's been a couple of studies, that religiosity in the United States, church attendance is going down. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons is because religion is now becoming partisan.
Wow.
Just like the pandemic became partisan and mask wearing has been partisan. Like, these are things that are corrupted by the right.
Yeah.
And they've gotten a lot of mileage out of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was from a political ploy, it has actually paid off great dividends for them. I'm not sure it's very smart for the churches themselves.
Right.
Church attendance is going down. And it does create this perverse, negative sort of reaction amongst progressives towards what should be teachings about love and fellowship. And I don't have to believe in God to appreciate a lot of those messages. Just
Absolutely.
Like, I can appreciate tenets of Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam, and it doesn't mean that I have to believe in the deity.
Right. And also there's a lot of, to say about how a lot of our original governments as a species really do kind of come from faith. But it's also such a perverse thing for Republicans to corrupt, because they are the ones who are constantly talking about how we are, under God and faith and this, that, and the other. But there's some quote that I can't remember who to attribute it to, that says that the most segregated hour in the United States is Sunday Mass, because there are the white churches and then there are the black churches. And that is still very much the case, And then now we also see a lot of like Latino churches, and that's also just a whole other thing and a whole other way of worshiping. But the Republicans claim to be these huge people who are about family values and about the traditional faith. But at the same time, we're seeing all these voter suppression methods, especially in Georgia. We just saw Georgia has an amazing organizing effort called Souls to the Polls that happens on Sunday. And they do early voting. They drive their constituents, the black churches. And it is a huge time for, especially in the South, for black voters to get together in community and express their voice and go to the polls. And now we are seeing everywhere that early voting is being just slashed, especially on Sundays. And that's deliberate, that's intentional. So it's one of those things, it's not so much about faith or God, it's that the Republicans will find a way to make sure that people of color can't vote at whatever costs. And they will manipulate whatever message they need to manipulate to retain power, because they're not getting new followers as far as I can see.
No. In fact, they're trying to lock in a institutional majority by suppressing the popular majority. And then, on top of all that, which none of that is Christian, none of that is love thy neighbor, none of it,
right.
none of it.
Right.
On top of that, you have the hypocrisy of the way that the evangelical Christian white community attached themselves to Donald Trump, who may be quite literally the most morally repugnant human being in this country today. Everything that they claim to hate about libertine liberals, the divorces and the multiple wives, and he's paid for quite a few abortions in his life.
Right,
Of course he has. Sleeping with porn stars and like everything that they supposedly hate, they just ignored it. And suddenly it was like, well, the Bible says that the prophet isn't perfect. I forget the exact rationale, right? And there's a Bible verse where we're not asking for perfection. We're humans.
Right.
We're asking for a basic level. He's not somebody who went to church. The one time he cleared out Lafayette Square and walked across and then held the Bible upside down. Okay. And suddenly, after really like losing their heads over somebody not saying, the word God in a presidential address, right? To go from that to a president who didn't go to church, didn't care about church, couldn't quote a Bible verse to save his life.
Yeah.
When he wrote it down for him, he said it wrong, right? What was it 2 Corinthians? 2 Corinthians? Like he had no clue. And they were able to just overlook that. And I still don't really understand why.
Yeah.
I don't get it.
And you've been very much on the record recently saying that, we can become the party of family values as Democrats now, especially because, for me, this wasn't a selling point but for a lot of Americans, it was. Joe Biden is actually a man of faith. Like he is actually a church-going Catholic. There's that iconic picture of him when he was vice president, when they were taking down bin Laden, and he was holding a rosary and genuinely in prayer. And so it's just an interesting thing that the Republicans can no longer claim that they are not that they ever really could, but that message is getting thinner and thinner and thinner.
I mean, they claimed it and the press sort of gave it to them. There was this assumption that, of course, Republicans are the party of national security and family values. All those things. So I think, we're almost Reverend Dr. Barber. I didn't ask the exact, but I think it's Reverend Dr. William Barber. Yeah. So he's about to come on, so I'm pretty excited about this. but yeah, there was always this assumption that Republicans were the party of national security, lower taxes, and family values, right? And family values speaking to that religiosity, and that they were somehow anointed, but in godliness. And and we've talked about it a lot. And with Trump, he sort of threw everything out except lower taxes, right? The rich still got theirs.
Yes.
The rich will always get theirs, and that's definitely something that Dr. Reverend Barber can speak to very eloquently. The rich will always get theirs, but they've used religion as a tool to sort of control these masses of white poor people.
Yeah.
And they don't intend to deliver for them, because that's really not what that the party apparatus is focused on. They're focused on tax cuts. And that's the one thing that they would never surrender, that Donald Trump would never surrender, no matter how much the press tried to paint him as a populist.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
hating on immigrants like us and our families does not make somebody a populist. So the Reverend Dr. William Barber is ready to join us. So let me introduce you. I introduce him. So the Reverend is very, very busy. He's the president of Repairers of the Breach. It's an organization training religious leaders in activism, seeking a more just and equitable society, or as they put it, quote, advancing a moral agenda that uplifts our deepest constitutional and moral values of love, justice, and mercy. Man, I love that. The Reverend is also the architect of the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina, which is a campaign of sustained civil disobedience. He is co-chair of Unite the Poor, which organizes the Poor People's Campaign, and we're going to be talking a lot about that today. They're working on things like voting rights, a $15 minimum wage, and so on. And Reverend Dr. William Barber, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Can you see me well? We were trying to do a little light adjustment here.
We can see you great.
You look fantastic.
I'm in a room.
You sound good too.
All right.
No, you're all great.
Well, Marco, thank you. And Cara, I was cheating now and listening into your beginning. I just wanted to say right off the top, it's not Trump. The Republican Party has long time ditched authentic Christianity and religion. He's just a symptom. And I often tell people, one thing's got to be careful in this moment. When you get a cold or pneumonia and you sneeze, the sneeze is the symptom. The mucus is the symptom. It's not the problem. I don't mean to describe the former president as mucus, but
you can. You can.
I was going to praise you for that.
But I'm trying to make a point. And then also, I think that the media didn't just do this. Slave master religion. That Frederick Douglass said, I love the religion of Jesus, but I love the Christianity of Jesus, but I hate the religion of slave master. This religious position that Kevin Cruz talks about. I hope all your audience will read that book called One Nation Under God, The Purchasing of the American Pulpit. And he talks about how there was a reaction to the social gospel movement that produced the New Deal, really, and produced the first female labor secretary and pushed Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And groups like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Sun Oil and others, they said, wait a minute, we can't, who has the moral authority? And somebody said, but the churches do, but they're preaching the social gospel. They said, well, how can we interrupt that? And they hired this guy out of California. And he actually told him, if you give me enough money, I can produce an alternative kind of a quasi-Calvinism. If you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell. So if you're good, you're middle class and rich. If you're bad, you're poor because it's your own fault. And I can purchase pulpits. And inside of 10 years, he had like 19,000 pulpits that they had purchased and given these crazy sermons to preach. And that's the foundation from which the moral majority, the religious right, and all that stuff comes out from. It's the unholy connection between money and the purchasing of religion. And to make religion the chaplain of the state, as opposed to religion being the critic and the prophetic imagination within the state.
That's wow. And it sort of ties into a lot of like that prosperity gospel that is also.
That's where it came from.
Right. Okay.
Right. It's different. See, it all grows out of slave master religion. Because remember what slave master religion had to do. Slave master religion had to say, it was a way of justifying the unholy and trying to make it unholy. So as Tiasha Coates has taught us, Race is the son of racism. Racism is not the son of race. Racism, policy ways of treating people differently by their race, came first, wanting to do the policies. Then race becomes the way you do it. So, for instance, in order to produce slavery, you had to have 5 things happening simultaneously. You had the evil economics, the means justifies the end, 6 sociology, that some people have to be up here and some people have to be down here. You had to have bad biology, that skin color, the differences determine brain size. So if you're black, you're brown, you're Asian, you're yellow, whatever, that determines a different brain size. And then 4th, you had to have a political pathology, where, like Chapman said, everything we did, the racism and slavery, was under the table like a cobra waiting to strike. Writing of the Constitution, everything was being determined. But the last thing you have to have in a society that dares to say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal, endowed by their creator. In order to say that and then contradict it, you must have something called heretical ontology. And that is the thought that God intended the separation. God intended the racism, the slavery, the over-under. And that's what slave master religion did. And so what we have seen down through the years is a continuous kind of reinvention of that, right? Yeah. And all of it is always an attempt to make religion the chaplain of the state, as opposed to the critic of the state. And Donald Trump is the latest one to embrace it, but it's really not his fault. It's the fault of the Jerry Falwells, Jr. and Senior, the Franklin Grahams, and all of these folk who claim to be evangelicals. I'm an evangelical, but interesting what they claim to be, white evangelical. Well, white is more important than evangelical. And what they do is, and lastly, all of them got their hype when they the first thing they were against was not gay people and not abortion. They were against their private schools not getting federal money. They were against desegregation. And they said that desegregation was anti-God. And then later on they became all these other things. But what we find is they also, at the end, I wrote an article on this in the New Yorker, you have to watch the connection between them, the ruling class, and money. Because it's an evangelicalism that at the end of the day, they support policies that hurt the poor and reward the rich, which, kind of sounds like what Jesus stood up against in his day.
I mean, if you read the text, it should be pretty obvious which side is straying from the teachings. Before you came into the green room, Reverend, Kara and I were talking about how we're not believers, and what you're talking about is actually quite interesting because it fueled my path towards atheism. I was raised Catholic, and the more progressive I became, the more disturbed I became with religion, because it sort of seems it was hijacked by these white evangelicals. And I met you in Asheville, North Carolina a few years ago. I don't know if you remember, but it was at the St. James African Methodist Episcopal Church in Asheville with Reverend Brent Edwards. And I sat in that church and I listened to sermons by the Reverend Edwards and by you, sitting in that incredible community, and the joy in the singing and the energy. And it's probably the closest I've ever come to sort of this notion of God. And it was, even if we take away the singular God figure, it was spiritual. It was definitely a spiritual moment. And I don't think I'd ever experienced that. Definitely not in any Catholic church growing up, right? And I wonder how different I would have been had I sort of grown up in that culture, in that atmosphere. And it gave me new appreciation, not for the activism. That I always had humongous appreciation for what you do in the activism, but more appreciation for that spiritual side. Yeah. And so I really appreciate you and the work you do. And that spiritual component, the Black left has it. I don't think you disagree.
See, that's the other thing. This stuff is not that black and white, actually. So for instance, in the abolition movement, you had white evangelicals like William Lloyd Garrison, who was as anti-slavery and willing to put his life on the line, just like Frederick Douglass. You had Harry Beecher Stowe, who was deeply Christian, willing to put her life on the line, like Harriet Tubman. You had Sojourner Truth, who worked with the women's suffrage movement. Mother Jones was a person of deep faith. So it's not actually that black and white. We try to sometimes say the black church. Well, remember now, Dr. King got put out of his denomination. We don't talk about that. He was put out of the church by the religious heads who said he was going too fast and needed to be slow. That's why he founded the SCLC. And that's why the Progressive Baptist Convention was begun. And so what I think is more important, let's go back to that day in Asheville. You know, part of what it is when a true reading of scripture, an authentic reading of scripture in our deepest religious traditions actually teach us that there is no separation between spirituality and activism. That to be spiritual is to be active on the side of the poor and the least of these. And in just the Bible itself, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament, there are over 2,000 scriptures that speak to how people of faith are supposed to care for the poor, the least of these, women, children, and the immigrant. 2,000 scriptures. If you went through the Bible and cut all of those texts out, the Bible would fall apart. Now, the problem is too often we've had too many people handling the Bible, praying over the Bible, laying hands and giving prayers on the Bible. But after they do that, they then pray, P-R-E-Y, on the very people that the Bible instructs us, that God instructs us we should care about. So even when we say a person of faith like Biden, for me, I don't think he's a person of faith because he goes to church or building. See, I think that's counter what Jesus said. What makes one a person of faith? Jesus says, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was an immigrant, did you welcome me? Jesus' first sermon was, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because I preach good news to the poor. So one of my professors said, you can call your church going to spirituality, whatever you want to call it. But if it does not challenge the systems of oppression, then it is terribly suspect of being a spiritual experience. So at St. James, I think one thing you experience, because you remember I told you, I'm an atheist too, if you want me to think that God is on the side of hating people, that God hates gay people, that God is for tax cuts for the wealthy, if God is for low wage. I don't believe in that God either. Right? But what you experienced, remember while you were in Asheville, we were doing Moral Mondays. Yeah. And white folk in the mountain and black folk were joining together to stand against a legislature who claimed to be evangelical, but they were hurting people's water in the mountain. They were blocking living wages. They were blocking health care. They were cutting $1 billion from public education. They were passing voter suppression laws. And black and white folk came together in that church, and the fervor was around, not just we were having a good time, but the fervor was around what united us was the fight. And the music and the prayers and the preaching all were a part of the fight. So it's actually not separated. For me, to love Jesus is to love justice. There's no separation. To be a person of spirituality means I can't be a person of indifference or a person of apathy or a person who just goes along to just get along. And that's been the challenge in American society on both sides, among black people, white people, brown people, native people. It's not so clear and cut. You know, like you got some black folk now that are running around with Franklin Graham and right. Claiming there's no racism. Black people. Now, you know, I know that one of the problems with that is, you know, a ventriloquist can always find a good dummy. And so, you know, the ventriloquists of white supremacy can always find people to say what they say, but not look like they look. But at the end of the day, it's always a remnant. And I want folk to remember that. When Dr. King, for instance, and the welfare rights women and Cesar Chavez and other groups started the Poor People's Campaign to address the other America. And he announced that he was going to focus on 3 evils that he had always focused on, but more clear with poor folk: racism, poverty, militarism. The next morning, after he preached that sermon at Riverside Church, 1 year exact to the day he was murdered, 150 newspapers wrote against him. Religious groups came out against him. Civil rights organizations, the NAACP and others, wrote resolutions against him. So when he was headed to the Poor People's Campaign, he was headed there with a remnant of people. of different faith traditions and all, but what united them was clarity around militarism, poverty, and racism were triune evils that robbed the human spirit and the human possibility of what ought to be our quote unquote God right.
If you would
I would love to just, because you went into a lot there, and I really kind of want to back up because we really hit the ground running, if you don't mind, Marcos.
No, go.
Please, Rev Doctor, I really wanted to know, and you touched on this for sure, a little bit more about your upbringing for our listeners who might not be as familiar with you. And it seems pretty obvious what called you to serve both in church and in broader justice. But we would love to hear a little bit more of your backstory, of your origin story, if you will.
Well, in quick nutshell, my father and mother decided in 1963 that they would come back to the South. They were living in Indiana. My dad had been born in the South to help with desegregation. We didn't come back until 1966, but remember, that was 12 years after Brown, and still in North Carolina, most systems had not desegregated. In fact, I went to segregated public school, kindergarten and first grade. I went in 68, 69, and 70. So my father was a minister. He could have stayed in Indianapolis. He could have been one of the leading big time ministers, but he made a commitment of calling. He felt a call to come back to Eastern North Carolina and serve in rural Eastern North Carolina, still today, the 13th poorest congressional district. Now, I have over 500 years of preaching on my father's side of the family, 300 on my mama's side of the family. So naturally, I ran. I didn't want to have nothing to do with preaching. I mean, when I first went to undergraduate school, I picked the school that had no requirements to take religious courses. And part of it was because I saw, Marco, some of the same things. You saw the hypocrisies, and even though I was in a quote unquote Black church, it was very conservative. They pushed my daddy out. They believed, we preach about heaven and it's going to be all right in the by and by. We maintain here, but it wasn't really clear about justice. And my father taught me, though, the scriptures that were clear, that to serve Jesus is to love justice and to love all people, regardless of their race, their color, their sexuality. I went to school to go to law school and had an epiphany in my junior year, and went home and told my father about it. And we went driving down the east coast of North Carolina along Manio Nags Head. And we had this conversation about whether I could do what I was called to do inside the church or outside of the church. And I had to get real clear with the difference between the fallacies of human beings and the rightness of the call for love, truth, and justice that our deepest religious traditions call us to. So I finished school, preached a trial sermon, what we call a trial sermon back then, went to seminary at Duke, and then I went to pastor in Martinsville, Virginia, a small town. But even there, I got confronted with ecological devastation and racism and union rights. I never will forget going to a meeting where we were challenging the company that was denying people union. They would work in that country 30 years. Their retirement was $3 for every year they worked, no health care, and a watch.
Jeez.
And people would leave and die. So we started organizing for a union. And one morning we went to meet with the CEO, said he would meet with us for breakfast. And he called all these ministers in. We met for breakfast. We were supposed to have a conversation about union rights. He got up and said, Reverend so-and-so, how you like that parking lot that we gave so-and-so? Brother so-and-so, what about those choir robes and so-and-so? And then he said, okay, we're leaving. So I was young. I raised my hand and said, wait a minute, where are you going? We're going to have a conversation. He said, I just did. And the next day, almost every one of those clergy came out in the newspaper with a letter signed against the union.
Wow.
And I found myself again dealing with that remnant, right, of fighting. Lastly, I came back to North Carolina, pastored a church in Goldsboro, North Carolina, in what we call a tier 3 county, which is a very poor county. And I've been there. I served as president of the NAACP, the largest NAACP in the South State Conference, the second in the country, and then was called to this work in 2016. And it started with I thought we were supposed to do a 7-state tour. I used to tell people, I thought the Lord said 7 states. We ended up doing 26 states in 6 months, called the Mar Revival Tour.
Wow.
And I found that there was a deep hunger in the country that some people had been turned off by white evangelicalism, Americanity, and all of this other stuff. But there was still a group of folk, and some of them weren't people of faith per se, but they did agree with the deep teachings about truth and justice and caring for the least of these. And guess what? I come from a tradition that says God has many that are not of this fold, and that they're not against me. They must be for me. So we welcome all people, regardless of their faith traditions, into the repairs of the breach and the moral revival in the Poor People's Campaign.
Wow, that's beautiful. A lot of the work that you're doing in all these organizations are really centered around, obviously, economic justice.
Yeah.
You know, fight for a $15 minimum wage, for student debt relief, and so on. Fighting against voter suppression. What is that? What is the underlying thread that ties all that entire fight together? Like, is there a single thread that you can say this is what all of this fight is about? Because there's so many disparate issues, and as liberals, everybody has their issue, right? And there's so many.
That's right.
Is there a single thread? And I'm pretty sure that you probably have a good answer for this one.
Well, the silos are important for us to work in our silos: voting rights, union rights, ecological rights. But when we look at through history, our greatest movement in this country has happened when we've had moral fusion movements, like the moral fusion movement that came together after the Civil War that birthed the first Reconstruction. Now, every Reconstruction was assassinated and murdered. They didn't just stop. But when black and white, former slave, freed person, and poor whites came together after the Civil War, they changed the South and changed the country, brought us the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. They changed constitutions all over the South. They guaranteed public education in states. They pushed for the equal protection clause, equal protection under the law in the Constitution. They were writing new labor laws, new criminal justice laws. They reshaped voting. They reshaped the courts. And then, of course, there was this redemption movement that decided to undermine all of that violently. And get, by the way, their theory was we must take America back. Just so you know, this is in the 19th century. And a president who lost the popular vote in 1877 was their key linchpin, Rutherford B. Hayes, to doing the take back. And so then you had the civil rights movement, which was moral, which was really not, people say it was about just civil rights, but even the March on Washington. Do you know that speech was not "I Have a Dream"? That wasn't the name title of that speech. That was the closing. That's what black preachers call a hoop. That was the ending. The speech was actually entitled "Normalcy Never Again." And originally at that march, you know what they were supposed to do? They were supposed to have a week of activities, sit-ins and sit-downs, because they were calling for voting rights and a living wage and labor rights. That's what the focus of the march was. A $2 minimum wage, which would be $15 today, and a civil rights act that would also include voting rights. Now, that's the part people don't talk about. So it was a fusion of people and movement. Today, in the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival that I co-chair with Rev Dr. Liz Theo Harris, we believe there are 5 interlocking injustices. Systemic racism, and that all racism, from black folk to brown folk to Asian, even the collateral damage that happens to white people. Systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, militarization of our community, and the false moral narrative of religious nationalism. But the thread that holds it all together is that there are 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country before the pandemic, 8 million more since the pandemic. You think about that. That's 43% of this nation before the pandemic were poor and low wealth when you measure it the right way. Now, our current government way of measuring poverty, which is 50-some years outdated, and it was wrong, it was too low when they did it, says if you make $12,800 a year, you're not poor. That's foolishness. But the truth of the matter is there are 140 million people prior to the pandemic who are poor or $400 away from economic disaster. Only 31% of Americans can afford a $1,000 emergency. Now, lastly, real quick, of that 140 million, over 50% of all our children. Of that 140 million, 66 million are white, 26 million are black. But the 26 million black is 60.9% of black folk. And the 66 million white are 30% of white people, 68% of Latinos, 68% of indigenous people. And what we find is that those 5 interlocking injustices have to be addressed simultaneously to deal with the issue of poverty, beginning with restating and remeasuring poverty. And what it does, Marcos, is we are organizing in Appalachia and in Alabama. We're organizing in Kentucky with Kentucky mine workers and Kansas farmers. Last year on June 20th, we had a virtual mass Poor People's Assembly march on Washington because of COVID. 2.7 million people showed up. We've got 45 coordinating committees now in 45 states, 300 partners, over 2,000 clerics. Because when I went to Eastern Kentucky one time, and I put those 5 issues up on the board, and I said to my brothers in Harlan County, let's stop for a minute and talk about racism. And I showed them racist voter suppression in Kentucky. Then I showed them a map of who benefits from racist voter suppression, and then what the people that benefit from it vote for. They found out that the very people that sell them the lie about voter fraud and push voter suppression also vote against unions, also vote against labor rights, also vote against healthcare, which is needed in Harlan County. So I asked them the question, what do you think about that? And one of the guys stood up and said, well, damn, Reverend, we're being played against each other. I said, now what are we going to do about that? And so we're trying to say that poor and low wealth people make up 30% of the electorate now. That's the only place you can fundamentally shift power in this country. In 15 states, if poor and low wealth people vote between 1% in Michigan and 19% in North Carolina, they can fundamentally outdistance the margin of victory of whoever is sitting in the United States Senate or the presidency or in the governorship in those states. Now, why don't poor and low wealth people vote? Well, we did a study with Columbia University professor, and we found, number one, most people that make under $50,000 didn't vote for Trump. The lie is that poor folk put Trump in. That's not true. Most poor and low wealth folk didn't vote. Okay. Secondly, the reason they didn't vote is, number one, they said because nobody ever talks about poverty. Nobody calls their name. Number two, voter suppression. And number three, they can't get off work. This past election, 55% of poor and low wealth people voted for Biden-Harris. We touched 3.7 million poor and low wealth infrequent voters in 10 states.
Wow.
So we've got to get we got to rephrase. And I tell a lot of my liberal brothers and sisters, stop saying that poor folk are being fooled by Republicans. And not even by Republicans. I don't call them Republicans. My granddaddy was a Republican, but he was an Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt Republican. This not poor folk. Most poor and low wealth folk in 2016, only 29 million of the 64 million poor and low wealth people voted. In 2020, 34 million voted. That still leaves 30 million that did not vote. That's where we have to focus, but we can't focus on poverty without dealing with systemic racism, systemic poverty, ecological devastation, denial of health care, the war economy, and this false moral narrative. But poverty and low wealth ties it all together.
Reverend Doctor, tying into that, I would really love to hear what your insight is with how the new White House and the Biden administration is succeeding and where they're failing in meeting the needs of people in poverty, people of color, people who are just disproportionately affected by systemic problems.
Yeah, because Democrats and Republicans have failed the poor.
Absolutely.
Republicans have blamed the poor, saying it's their moral problem, and Democrats act like they can't say poverty. They got to say something like those trying to make it into the middle class. Some folk are poor. I was talking. I was on with a call yesterday, and they said they had talked to this messaging guru, and he said we should not call people poor because it points to their deficit. I said, who told you that? He says, well, I studied. I said, well, you must not have studied poor people, because the poor people that I'm around, they want somebody to say something about poverty and low wealth, and they don't see their poverty as their deficit. They see it as a deficit of the nation. Because as Jeffrey Sachs and I talk all the time, the great economist, we don't have a scarcity of money, nor do we have a scarcity of ideas. We got a scarcity of will. You know that last bill they just passed, the COVID relief bill? If they had kept $15 in there, 40% of poor and low wealth Black folk would have been raised up out of poverty with one vote.
Wow.
If they had kept 15 in there, it would have affected 62 million people who work for less than $17 an hour, and would have pumped $330 billion into the economy, particularly if they did the 15 immediately. So the issue is not scarcity. So when we met with the Biden administration's planning team, we said to the president, he came to a gathering we had last year. We had about 1,400,000 people. We invited Trump. Trump didn't come, so Biden came. He said these words to us: a theory, ending poverty will not just be an aspiration, but a theory of change. That's the first time we had heard that since the war on poverty. We said, ooh, okay, what do you mean by that? So we met with Susan Rice and the other folk, and we didn't meet with them by ourselves. We took 35 people on a Zoom, the majority of them poor and low wealth people, and we let poor and low wealth people present their own agenda. And they said to them with us, there are 14, we call them 14 points for the healing of the nation. I won't go through all of them, but one of them was redoing how we measure poverty, infrastructure, but infrastructure that goes to the bottom and it targets poor and low wealth communities first, and deals with ecological devastation, a living wage, guaranteed income, using the tax code to address poverty by doing things like child income tax credit permanently, and earned income tax credit permanently, and reversing the 2016 steal. That was the real steal that we should have stopped. The stealing of all the tax dollars and giving it back to the wealthy so they could buy back their own stocks, and healthcare and so forth and so on. Now, when we are seeing a number of those things coming out, now, we remain critical, even as we are supportive. We are so glad to see a president that's trying to tell the truth and has said the word poor. And in his first speech before Congress he said lifting from the middle up won't work, and from the top down, we must build from the bottom up. That's our language. That's the same thing the Pope has recently said. The Pope recently said that trickle-down economics and neoliberalism were the kind of false magic that is taking the world backwards. So we are celebrating that, but we also are challenging him. We say, now, we passed this one-time COVID relief bill, okay? And you got child income tax credits in there, but you dropped off 15. Now, you can't raise the children out of poverty if the parents are still in poverty. And plus, you can't say that the child income tax credit will end 50% of child poverty, because it's not even permanent. It's just till December. So let's say we have the potential to do that. But also we're saying to him, you got to recognize the systemic problems that have been exposed during COVID were there before COVID. COVID exposed them, and it's not one thing. And so this week, you're going to get the first of this. We're going to be rolling out, beginning tomorrow, a resolution laying out an omnibus vision for the kind of omnibus policy that will produce a third reconstruction in this country to fully address poverty and low wealth. And we're going to say to America, if you all really want to do this, now, if you're ready to do this, it can be done. The special rapporteur at the UN did a study on the grossness of poverty in this country, but he also said it's not the scarcity, it's not the ideas, it's the scarcity of moral will and motivation. And then we're going to organize around this resolution. We're going to critique every piece of legislation from the perspective of the poor. We're going to have another virtual gathering on Washington, D.C. in June. And then we're announcing in June. I want to come back, Marcos, because you're my friend.
All right.
I'll tell you what I want. I want Daily Kos to help us organize for 365 days the biggest, most generationally transformative march on Washington. Poor people, low-wage worker, mass assembly and moral march on Washington, June 18, 2020. We're going to put a face on this. And we're not going to have a bunch of people talking for the poor. We're going to put that Kansas farmer on the stage with that black Kentucky fast food worker and that Kentucky miner and that black person from the Delta of Mississippi on the stage with poor folk from upstate Massachusetts. And we're going to register massively to vote. And we're going to push policy. Because if we don't have a third Reconstruction, and I'm very serious about this, talked to a lot of economists. Joseph Stiglitz wrote a book called The Price of Inequality. You know, we often talk, well, how much will it cost? How much does it cost not to do this? We lose $1 trillion a year from child poverty. $1 trillion a year. We lose billions of dollars every year from the lack of wages. And we put 54 cents of every discretionary dollar into the war economy and less than 16 cents in infrastructure and healthcare and wages and education. So here's the question. How can a nation of this amount of wealth fundamentally have a fruitful, strong democracy if we don't establish justice and promote the general welfare and nearly 50% of our people are poor and low wealth? You can't sustain that. That's a recipe for all kinds of upheaval. It can't be sustained. And so lastly, as my friend at MIT, to come to me in a minute, he said, Otto Schwammer, he said, we have to move from an ecosystem-based economy to an ecosystem-based economy that understands we are all connected. And he said, the greatest problem with our economic system as it is working now is the problem of consciousness and conscience. How do we allow 250,000 people a year, 750 people a day to die from poverty before the pandemic? 7 people die from vaping. We have a congressional hearing, White House meeting, everything from vaping. And 750 people, according to a study from Columbia University, before the pandemic were dying a day from poverty. The religion that I believe in, the God I believe in, the faith I believe in, would call that oppression, injustice, evil, wrong, sin, and a violation of fundamental human rights.
Reverend, I love the framing of a third Reconstruction, and Kara, Daily Kos is definitely we're gonna be happy.
We need you, Daily Kos. We need you.
I'm in the DC area. I'm in. Let's go.
All right, I'm gonna hold you to that. I don't forget.
So we're out of time, but I want to give you a chance to let people know how they can join your efforts for the third Reconstruction.
Let me thank your audience. If I've not been clear, blame it on my head and not my heart, as we say in the church. But go to www.breachrepairs.org, sign up for the newsletter, sign up for the tweet, sign up for all the social media. And then if you go to Repairs, it'll take you to the Poor People's Campaign, or you can go straight there, www.Poor People's Campaign. On this coming Monday, we've got a big, massive National Moral Monday talking about the filing of this major resolution. And then on June 21st, Monday, June 21st, you need to join us for the virtual mass poor people, low wage workers assembly, moral march on Washington, and the launch for the 365 days of organizing to next year's in person, because we're going to change the narrative. We're going to put a face on this problem, and we're going to build power and call this nation to the resolve that it's time for a third Reconstruction to fully address poverty and low wealth.
Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, thank you so much for your time. And you said you're not going to forget Kara's promise. I heard your promise to come back on the show later this year, and so we're gonna definitely come back asking you guys.
And when I see you, I'm gonna say, you remember the Spirit made you say that. Now it wasn't me. I'm gonna put that on the Spirit.
I'm perfectly happy with that.
Take care.
Thank you so very much. Bye-bye.
God bless.
So, Kara, we actually had a list of questions we were going to ask him, remember?
Yeah, I do. I remember.
Definitely one of those people that you don't need to prepare, because he is prepared. He has such a clarity of purpose that it almost doesn't matter what we were going to ask him. He was gonna zero in on what became a sermon about the work that he's doing, and it's incredible work. we when we first started this podcast, like we didn't ask people their origin story, and that's actually starting to become my favorite part of all our interviews, because who would have thought that his story included I'm running as far away from the clergy as I possibly can. I don't want anything to do with that. Find me a college without a divinity program.
I absolutely love that. And, and I think that that's what makes him such an effective communicator, both in spiritual and secular spaces, because I don't think I've ever heard a man of God say, well, if that's their God, I'm an atheist too. I was like, okay.
It's so incredibly disarming, right?
Yeah.
If you're conditioned to think of church and Jesus and God as tools of oppression, like he put it, which for the Christian right, they are. Mm-hmm. They are tools of oppression. And when he says something like that, it's just completely, okay, you are not trying to oppress me. Like, you're meeting me.
Right.
I said I'm an atheist. You're going to declare yourself an atheist. We know you're not an atheist. But the way he uses words and feelings and emotion to sort of say, like, no, I'm still with you. And I don't care if you believe or not in my God. We are after that same purpose. And he was totally right. At that church in Asheville, that sense of spirituality I felt, it was one of shared common purpose. We're all in this incredible fight, and I am so lucky to have these fellow travelers with me along for the ride, that I'm not by myself, that I have I have support, and we're all supporting each other. And it was an amazing moment. And I used to call myself militantly atheist. I don't anymore, because now it's evolved to a live and let live.
Yeah.
Don't use religion to oppress.
I actually, one of the first things, we didn't touch on this because the Reverend was here, but one of the first things I organized around was I worked for a nonprofit called the Secular Student Alliance. And we did a lot of separation of church and state stuff, and like providing usually LGBTQ students with like resources when their families would disown them. And then the more I got into that work, the more that me and the people who worked in that organization identified more with our activism than with our like secularism, and it's kind of the same thing with how he talked about faith, where he's like, my activism is my faith. And I'm like, oh, that's so funny, because my activism is my secularism, so to say. And it all is the same purpose,
Yeah, and I think purpose is sort of that bottom line, is what are we fighting for? And I also really like, and he's right, when I asked him to sort of pull in that thread, that common thread, it really comes into poverty, right? And by extension, it's protecting, the system protects the rights of the wealthy, right? I mean, like we talked before he came on, it's no accident that the only thing that Donald Trump delivered on that sort of Republican, family values, national defense, lower taxes. The only thing he delivered on was lower taxes, because that's the only thing that they really care about.
Right.
That's what they're designed to protect. And I really wish I had more time, because I would have asked them, those white poor evangelicals, is there a way to reach them, or are they lost? I'm sure he would say they're not lost, because he has that indomitable fighting spirit. He's not going to quit. He's going to go fighting for every possible. And that county he was talking about in Kentucky is actually an incredibly poor, very Trumpy, 80% Trump county, Republican in Appalachia. So he isn't afraid to go talk to these people and make this case that we're actually in this thing together. Mm-hmm. But it really comes down to economic justice. And from that flows everything else, right? Because nobody's putting in a toxic waste dump in a wealthy neighborhood.
Right.
They're putting in the poor people's neighborhood.
Yeah, I was really taken by his talking about the ecosystem, and every chance that he could, he talked about the environmental component of our work, and how that all has to do with economic justice, that has to do with fairness, that has to do with spirituality. And it is also one of those things that takes me like a little bit back, because I know faith as this thing that is anti-science, right? And he is there putting the economic argument, which is a lot of the economic argument that we hear from tribal groups and American indigenous groups, that they talk about the preservation of their culture and the ecosystem being essential to their traditions and to their beliefs. And so I just found it all so unbelievably delightful. I can't wait to go to his rally. But I also want to say that I think that one of the things that when we talk a lot about systemic injustices, we usually tend to talk about what we consider violent, which is like police brutality, the prison industrial complex, kids in cages, that kind of stuff. But economic injustice is just as violent. Someone not being able to have a home, or someone not being able to provide healthcare for their children, or any of that it's violence. And until we can start talking about it in that way, I think we're going to continue to have this like theoretical fight about taxes, a thing that most people still don't understand. Whereas when you talk about someone's livelihood, I think it's a lot more interesting, and we can really, I don't know, show how terrible the Republicans are.
Yeah, absolutely. So if anybody, I really, really encourage that you sign up for all of his organizations' email list, their SMS, that's cell phone. So the website is breachrepairers.org, or you can go straight to the poorpeoplescampaign.org, also goes to the same place, and that might be easier to remember, poorpeoplescampaign.org. You can also text the word moral to 66539. So moral to 66539, and that gets you on the cell phone text list. And I actually really, really encourage that you do so, because he's building something that is transcendental. It's I'm not kidding when I said that there's nobody I respect as much as the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber for the work that he's doing. And you all got to hear him, right? I mean, it's next level. It's next level stuff. So that's all the time we have this week. Thank you so very, very much for listening. Thank you, Kara, for guest co-hosting this week.
It's been my pleasure.
That is awesome. Thanks to Walter Einenkel for producing the show. And thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the show, be sure to subscribe and give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts. You can always talk to us at dailykos.com or on Twitter at Daily Kos. Thanks so much. See you next week.